My name's Neal Dennis. Thank you for joining us for our talk about collective defense, why collaboration is key to a healthy security posture. We're going to go ahead and dive right in. A quick agenda for today. We're going to come up with a couple of definitions. What is collective defense? We're going to walk through the Intel maturation model at a very high level, and then we're going to wrap that into the stages of collective defense. There's going to be a lot of iterative process here on purpose, kind of building that knowledge base and setting the ground here. And then finally get into that collective defense-driven cyber resilience perspective, and then with a nice little use case. So right off the bat, what is collective defense? So collective defense, in a nutshell, cybersecurity strategy, kind of getting everybody together, coordinating response efforts, and fusing the overall internal and external workflows that you have as a company, both from the stovepipes inside your org, breaking those down, as much as getting involved external with those sources of value outside, like the ISAC, sharing communities, government partners, and things like that. So as we start to kind of think about this a little bit within an org, we have varying levels of maturation, varying levels of capability that we can walk through. A lot of us obviously start off on the left-hand side here, reactive defense posturing, spend a lot of time responding to incidences, spend a lot of time trying to research and figure out where data is around these incidences. So a lot of responsive, reactive effort to try to contain these events that may be happening inside your four walls, with the goal of hopefully starting to figure out what data is available, figure out where you need to go with that data, both internal and external, and then start to get into that more proactive nature of working with the teams across the wall, from knowing what the red team is doing, what the vulnerability management team is doing for your SOC, and actually leveraging the rest of the org to start to build out that awareness and that data, and then taking kind of more intel analyst approach to some of this as well. So you're applying information to the data at this point, you're in a more proactive response, you're out in front of the threats, hopefully. But more importantly, you're starting to work more as a team internally across the security orgs at your company, and then building into that a lot more intel management flow and things of that nature, and very, very much getting into more of operationalizing of that data. And then on the far side of this, once we kind of get an understanding of what we're doing with the data, where we're at with that data, we've gotten a little bit better at being more proactive in that response. Now we're able to hopefully start to take those lessons learned, start applying them to more of an orchestration mentality, and get into that collective defense posture here, where the automation orchestration has picked up a little bit of that low-key actions for you, but you're also freeing up time for you to go out there, work a little bit more collaboratively, internally and externally, actually start holding meetings on where you're going, or working groups about where you want to go from a defense posture, what you need to move forward in your organization with security-wise. And then more importantly on that, actually making all that more actionable, allowing Intel to lead the decision-making process instead of constantly playing whack-a-mole and being in that more reactive state. Now, as we kind of think about this a little bit more from the problem set, we have a lot of issues trying to getting through those phases, and a lot of them happen to be with data management at their core, right? We see a lot of this in the orgs where a SOC has access to data type A, B, and C from source whatever value. You may or may not have an Intel team involved that's also got their own source, true source. But then you have people across the fence that are working on things that impact the SOC or that impact the vulnerability management team, but they're also using different source materials as well. And so all this data, even the incident response data, all these things kind of get siloed, constrained. You're not necessarily applying the right actionable type values to your data. You're not taking the knowledge you understand from your internal org and creating that kind of visibility across the spectrum. And more importantly, it's how do we go with all this data? How do we manage all this info and bring everybody together so we can be more proactive, right? It's a very hard hurdle to overcome. But trying to get everybody in the room, get everybody behind the right tool sets, and grab those lessons learned and push things forward a little bit. Now, when we start to conceptualize this external, there's a lot of things going on from your org out. There's a lot of data sets out there between the ISACs, the sharing communities, the certs that are out there, government, non-government spaces. And it's kind of a very similar thing. How do you take all that data in? How do you manage that data? How do you be proactive in the response with that data internal? But more importantly, is there a way for you to start interacting external with those true source values, with those sharing communities as well? So similar constraints, a lot of data, a lot of things to think about from a management perspective, a lot of things that you need to try to figure out how to centralize and get that data flow going. Now, when we start to think about this from an Intel maturation perspective, uh, straightforward, tactical, operational, strategic. And we think about these from the growth. When we're getting started from a reactive posture, we're kind of really focused on those tactical elements, right? We're focused on getting data in from wherever we can get it. We're focused on generating alerts and stopping things, wherever they come in, and having those alerts kick off in the SIM. Hopefully trying to position ourselves closer to the gateway or further out at some point in time. But it's still very tactical, very, very granularly focused. Now, as we start to move through this from a capabilities perspective, we get into that operational mentality. This is where we start to apply those lessons learned a little bit. This is where we start to apply our own value to that data, so that way the org has a little bit more structure behind what they need to do. You're prioritizing content. You're making an impact on where that content needs to go and what security stack needs to consume that. And more importantly, starting to kind of get a better idea of what's going on within the threat landscape as part of that prioritization. Now, as we grow into that strategic posture and we start getting in from proactive to more collective side of the house, we're looking at larger scale things that help push that proactive nature a little bit further along. But more importantly, you're hopefully at this level getting more of the org involved, more of the leadership involved in these decisions as well from the intel value and from a response perspective. You started tracking campaigns, maybe ones that are only impacting your org, but maybe they're ones that are cross-pollinated in your industry vertical. But at the same time, you're able to do this research, you're able to go out there and interact with your peer groups across different orgs, internal, external. You're able to go out to the ISACs, the certs, and things like that, and actually know the right questions to ask, get the right data back from them, and more importantly, action that through your company's security stack, and hopefully push the threat actors a little further outside the gateways, and stop that mitigation a little further out. And then when we get a little further down the road, you're doing a lot more things, once again, like orchestration, automation. You're hopefully doing, we have deception operations up on here, but those are kind of fun things. You're able to focus on more advanced tactics, techniques, and procedures on your own part to keep the threat from occurring closer to the actual end users. Now, from highlights here from this Intel maturation perspective, things from my perspective as an Intel analyst, I love having requirements. I build Intel requirements out. I think it's a stage one thing. If you don't understand what your actual requirements are, how can you possibly make the right decisions for the technology you want to bring in? So building requirements, and not just Intel requirements, but understanding what data you need. That's part of the Intel requirement piece, right? But also understanding how that data can impact your security stack and what might be missing in that security stack, and making those adjustments and those assessments back up to the leadership, mapping those requirements out to risk controls and risk assessments even that the C-suite has. So there's a dollar sign that the C-suite has. You should be able to map a requirement to it and hopefully make that judgment call from the leadership a little bit easier when you go to request for resources. So requirements are very key to starting off down this journey. Aggregating data, actioning that data once again in that reactive process. You're getting data in, you're getting alerts hopefully, and you're doing something in that responsive effort, that more reactive posture to get there. As we start to kind of grow a little bit, we understand our data, we understand a little bit more about what it's doing for us, which allows us to start making assessments on that data, allows us to start doing more around collaborating with that data, asking the right questions within the community that you're involved in, whether that's the person right across from you on the other side of the cubicle wall, or whether that's someone half a world away in another sharing community, right? And then you're starting to apply your own analytics to the data. You're starting to make heads or tails of the value coming into your system and saying, source A is a little better than source B, or when source A reports a hash versus an IP, that means a little bit more to me. And you're able to automate out that understanding a little bit more. You're able to start getting a little bit more preventative as we get into level 3 here. And all that knowledge, all that understanding plays into those preventative controls. It allows you to be more reactive and automated with the data, and have that structured out to where you've got these lessons learned, apply them, automate them out, and move on to better and bigger things. And in more in particular, once you get a good understanding, hopefully you're still collaborating, you're getting involved with the communities out there and getting understanding of what data needs to go where a little bit more, deprecation, valid, invalid type data sets, and all that fun stuff that matter as you grow in this maturation, as you kind of clear out your queue a little bit. Now, all that being said, there's no reason why you shouldn't already be sharing and collaborating internally and externally at every part of this. It's just, freeing up time and finding ways to be more proactive in that response. Same thing with, doing preventative controls. This isn't you must do 1 to get to 2 to get to 3. There's plenty of people who are piecemealing on 3 that haven't even had requirements, for instance, right? There's plenty of people who don't understand the data inside their own 4 walls, but they're actively collaborating, and that's fine. Those are good ways to get you through all of this and mature your overall security posture. Now, as we get back into kind of what this means from a collective defense piece, if we look at kind of once again the current states and challenges of all this, it all really does come down once again to kind of intel management, data management. What are you doing to help the analysts in the system not necessarily have to constantly be doing, an hour's worth of research in 10, 15 minutes to answer a ticket, right? So if we think about the data sources, we think about their values, we need to understand that at some point in time, you either A, need to whittle down those data sets, or B, you need to give them ways to help automate some of that research, right? So it's hard on an analyst to go through 20, 30 data sets when they're trying to respond to that incident, that ticket with a yes, no, maybe within an SLA requirement, 10, 15 minutes, whatever yours might be. So providing them resources to overcome that hurdle. And then once again, once they're done, there's so many things on the right-hand side of that could go to from a security controls perspective. It's getting it there is one problem, but understanding what happens once it's there is another one. We like to create data, we like to push it out, we like to create responses, but what's the actual end value of that? What actually happened? Is it still generating some kind of notice in that thing that they could use, that device that they could use as additional enrichment down the road? Or is it just flat out blocked? Things like that. They need to understand the impact of the data that they're producing, that feedback loop. Now, as we think about the stages of this, we go back to the operationalizing of this data. So aggregating, normalizing the data, it's very important to find a standard and stick to it. It's very important to get the data into a succinct format that everybody understands, collaborate, fuse all that together into one kind of vantage point, allow people to see that, allow people to start applying their own understanding of that data and make heads or tails of what's important, and then being able to start getting into those automated actionings of that data, right? But first and foremost, standardization of what's going on within the data sets. As we grow into kind of that phase 2 piece that, we're moving into more of the automation side of the house, we're getting our scoring set up for the data. We're applying our own insights into the value of that data a lot more proactively. And then we're probably taking in a few more succinct sources like this, like the community data, the ISACs, the search, things of that nature, and being able to action them a little more readily and with a little bit more focus. Now, there's still some manual things going on. You're still maybe pulse checking some of the new rules and automations that you set up. You may even be going in there and tweaking data as it comes in and creating intel reports based off of new information. That's perfectly fine. All that still is going to happen. You're never going to get rid of the human in the loop completely. And then as we get over kind of that far right-hand side, automating the known knowns. There's a lot of data that comes in that you have some level of trust with. There's a lot of things that provide scores and criticality ratings and things like that. So you can automate a lot of that in your initial response efforts. But even more importantly, being able to take what you've actioned and on those low-hanging things, an IP comes in, you block it at the firewall, or it kicks off an alert, and then you react to it based off of intel. The IP's bad. There's all sorts of ways to also automate your sharing back out into the communities. So being proactive, creating some kind of response in a somewhat automated fashion back to the organizations that you're working with. Once again, whether that's the vulnerability team and letting them know, hey, we saw this, they were taking advantage of X, Y, and Z exploit. We're just sending this over to you. And you can automate all those responses back out to those teams very, very quickly. Now, so collective defense, as we get into this from an internal org perspective, iterating what we just talked about, bringing in data, consolidating those feeds into more of a succinct viewpoint, standard of some sort that you can work with, and then growing that enrichment and analysis, that scoring, generating action items around that from an automation perspective, and being able to automate out these low-hanging fruit type items, and then allow your team to do a little bit more with that enrichment and hopefully that research phase, that threat hunting piece that we all hopefully get to at some point. Now, what does this start to look like when we start to grow this in a more community instance? Very typical model. Community org one has an incident, obviously success. They do the response effort. Hopefully at some point in time in that during that effort, they publish those observables, those IOCs at this point to a community, and that community picks those up. That incident is still kicking off. There's still probably an active campaign. If we think about most mal spam events, popular ones like Cancer and so on, they're days long, weeks long sometimes as they retweak and go out. So if you get it, you publish it, and hopefully you're helping bring up the other orgs within your community, within your collaborative environment a little bit more. So next time when they're at the tip of the spear and they're getting hit, they do the same thing back for you. And once again, all these things can be automated. You go through the response, we publish those observables into some kind of hub for everybody to consume, and then they get it. They have their own standards that are mapped out, cross-pollinate over, and they do their thing to help block that attack. Now, when we start thinking at this from a collaborative community perspective, ISAC, certs, and things like this do a really good job at bringing everything into a hub, at focusing everything in and allowing the communities to come together, have their mutual responses into the system, and get that initial pulse check of, at least, hey, am I alone in this? Or is everybody else in the community seeing this too? Kind of those efficacy checks that we all hope for when we see something malicious come across our wire. Because obviously, if you're left alone and you're the one being targeted, that's a holistically different response effort than if you realize that this is a more broad-reaching campaign. And so, being able to take your data, publish it to some kind of hub focus, the search, the ISACs, things like that, get that interaction from a community involvement, and know that you can automate out a good chunk of this sharing, not only putting it into the system, but also with the right community, being able to automate the consumption back out of that community. Now, from a case study perspective, just real quick, cyber fusion from a resiliency model, right? So the whole concept here is bringing everybody together, bringing everybody into one kind of focused effort around security and mitigating threats. There's physical threats, obviously, there's digital threats, there's fraud, vulnerability management, threat hunters, all these individuals coming together. Basically, in my mind, if it's security related, physical or digital, y'all should all be sitting in the same room at some point in time to talk about the instances, or at least have access to that data in some kind of consolidated fashion. Because we see too often, a fraud event on a website that kicked off with a DDoS event that leads to some kind of account takeover event, so on and so forth. And at the same time, they're over there pushing on a server, trying to exploit a known vulnerability, right? So all these things, fraud team's taking care of one, the SOC team's taking care of another, and maybe the network management team's taking care of the third because maybe you didn't have your DDoS piece tied into your security platforms outright. All these things can come together. Everybody has a good say in this. And the question mark at the bottom, literally everybody in your company can probably have value added into how you're responding, what data you're looking at, the value of the information, also from what they're doing from a security perspective. So there's always room for different teams to come to the table, but most importantly, just getting everybody in the room at some point, having access to all the data that's there, letting people know what's impacting their environment from a security perspective, and then let's see those campaigns kind of unfold in a little more grandiose scale. From a use case side, this is one of our clients. This is how they went through kind of the architecture and implementation of this. If we look from a left and kind of go around clockwise here, from blue to peach and all the way back around, phase one, just getting through this, getting the detection tools online, getting the data into them, very, once again, reactive posture. But they set up their network, they set up the data set so they could get a better efficacy check on what kind of data was there. They collected those logs. They started allowing people to enrich and analyze those logs, but it was still very manual. And now as they started getting into that phase two piece, bringing on intel sources, right? They took those logs, they bumped them up against those intel sources. They started looking a little bit more into that automation piece from that enrichment process, to kind of grasp that those known knowns from the data sets that they were working with, and then going through those internal enrichment sources, which once again, we're already capturing logs from the beginning. Now let's look at what that really means a little bit more grandiose. Let's get down into the details of all that and start doing a more holistic packet capture even. So they went full throttle. They went in, they were capturing, like I said, packet capture on their network for this data. They were going back, replaying that, bumping that up against the known knowns and doing threat hunting against that. But they started to automate out a lot of that. They have the data coming in from a source. And they had data source coming in from internal and external. They bumped all that stuff up and started automating, connecting those dots. And then more importantly, when things started bumping up against each other, they had automated actions, as we get kind of into that phase three piece where, if something from the packet capture bumped up against something from an external enrichment source, they had a lot of automation to say, all right, go out and do X, Y, and Z to block at whatever device that needed to be. But then as part of that growth piece, they were bringing this into that centralized kind of fusion center hub mentality. So when those events kicked off, the totality of the security team was getting notified. They had the ability to go in and connect dots and see all these events that were kicking off, both from the manual and automated events that were playing out. And then everybody's able to work together, communicate together in a singular kind of mentality focus in a singular platform, and kind of raise the overall security posture of the company very, very quickly. But more importantly, focused on that collaboration piece as they're doing this research. Because once again, someone on the red team may have a good idea of what that vulnerability actually means because maybe they were researching it out for something that someone in the SOC. So if I publish that out for everybody else to see, who knows what kind of data you might get back out of the team from all that type of stuff. That kind of brings us to the end of the presentation. So kind of iterating here on, collaboration is key. We want to have that collaborative defense posture. We want our org to break down those silos, but we have to bring the right solution to bear. We have to have something that focuses on collaboration as part of its process, and understand that there's silos that can be broken down, but more importantly, there's people that want to be in a room to work together. And then that intel driven piece, there's so much data out there. If you don't provide some kind of focus on that data, and we start to get into that contextualization side, then you're just going to continuously be in reactive mode. The more people you can kind of help you contextualize the data and get that understanding, the sooner you're going to get into that proactive response, and hopefully into that more strategic level capability where you're sharing and working well in advance of the threat actors impacting your environment. And then all of this coming back down to, kind of the management of the data, the scalability of what's going on in your environment, and being able to start at one point, know what that is, assign those requirements, and have the right path forward to grow, and kind of keep things on that kind of environment agnostic approach, so everybody has a seat in the room, right? And then at the end of all that, be focused on analyzing, tracking what you're doing, lessons learned, find ways to automate these things. There's plenty of actions that you're taking today that could be taken over by some sort of automation or orchestration piece, so that way you free up time for your analysts to start getting into this more proactive and contextualization type effort. And so with that, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for joining our collective defense discussion.